That one glorious word represents more than just the geography between the Sabine and the Rio Grande. It represents a unique idea and way of life. A life of rugged individualism, proud self-reliance, gritty toughness, and fierce independence. That is what made Texas, and that is what will save her again. Howdy, folks. Sam Houston here. I want to thank you for tuning into the Feed Bandit podcast. Feed Bandit is the Texas first outdoors brand built by rabid Texans, for rabid Texans, and all those who aim to be one someday. We unapologetically promote the ideals that shape our Texas pride and Texas first patriotism through our love of hunting, the outdoors, and the gear and apparel we create. Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Check us out at feedbandit.com. And to repeat that great rallying cry from a former colleague of mine, liberty or death. Now, enough of my talking. Here are a couple of bandits that love Texas as much as I do. Enjoy.
Howdy, friend. Welcome back to the Feed Bandit podcast. Jimmy here, back with you on another edition of the series Leave the Swamp, where I have been reviewing the book TEXIT by Daniel Miller. It's been pretty interesting so far. We're at this point halfway through the first chapter. In this episode, I'm going to conclude the first chapter titled What is TEXIT? And I got to tell you, as of recording this video, there's a lot going on here leading up to the election, but we just had a couple of major hurricanes hit the country, and looking at the dismal and pathetic federal response to helping out the folks in Eastern Tennessee, Western North Carolina, that region there, this pathetic FEMA agency not doing anything, the pathetic administration not doing anything for these folks really, and actively working against helping them. Reading through this book actually really makes you wonder, what the hell are we getting for the money that's stolen from us every year in taxes? Not very damn much. And I tell you, if you're one of those folks over there, I'd be beside myself. And it just doesn't make sense anymore. We're not getting the value we should be getting from the amount of money that's stolen from us on an annual basis by Washington or Mordor, D.C. It's getting me a little fired up. So I think I'm going to end my pre-commentary here and begin the review of the rest of Chapter 1 of TEXIT, the chapter entitled, What is TEXIT? The Century of Self-Determination. It is important to recognize that the modern movement for Texas independence is not unique in a general sense and doesn't exist as some political or social aberration. In geopolitical circles, the 20th century is often referred to as the American century, in reference to the ascendancy of the United States as a global power. However, in retrospect, the 20th century deserves a moniker that is more reflective of geopolitical reality, the century of self-determination. This reality was not lost on author John Naisbitt in his 1994 work Global Paradox. A product of Harvard and Cornell universities, who served in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Naisbitt dedicated his professional life to political and economic futurism. Analyzing economic trends led him to publish his breakthrough work, Megatrends, in 1982. It has since sold 14 million copies. He gained an amazing reputation for his accuracy in trends analysis, which led to other books and numerous academic honors. Global Paradox was something different, though. While ostensibly a book on the impact of the telecommunications revolution on the world economy and how it was reshaping the future of global commerce, Naisbitt identified that the trend had political implications as well. The world's trends point overwhelmingly towards political independence and self-rule on one hand, and the formation of economic alliances on the other. Unquote. To be fair, Naisbitt didn't have to be a very good futurist to figure out the political ramifications of the trend. It was evidence to anyone who had been paying moderate attention to world events since the end of the Second World War. Between the end of the war and the publication of Global Paradox, the number of countries in the world had nearly quadrupled and showed no signs of slowing down. Indeed, between the publication of Megatrends and the Global Paradox, the world witnessed one of the most stunning displays of the collapse of a political and economic union when the Iron Curtain fell and the first members of the Soviet Union declared their independence. Those countries were not the larger states of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They were, in fact, the three small Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Although the Bolshevik government renounced all claims to these three countries in 1920 as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, Estonia and Latvia were declared part of the Soviet sphere of influence, while Lithuania was handed over to the Germans. By 1940, all three came under armed occupation by Soviet troops, their governments removed and replaced with pro-Soviet administrators whose first act was to join the USSR. By 1941, the Germans occupied all three countries until they were driven out by the Soviet invasion in 1944. In the post-war period, the Baltic states were considered full constituent republics of the Soviet Union that went on to declare their annexation of the territory as fully legal. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell, the Baltic states made their move. They amended their own constitutions, declaring the supremacy of their own laws over the edicts flowing from Moscow. By 1991, they had made clear their intention to declare independence, and after unsuccessful attempts to overthrow their respective governments, these three small republics made good on their promise. For the first time in 50 years, the peoples of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia enjoyed the right of self-government. Their bravery and tenacity proved to the thread that, once tugged, unraveled a world power. By Christmas Day of 1991, 12 more members of the Soviet Union were independent, adding 15 new self-governing nations to the world in less than 2 years. In typical succinct Russian fashion, Yevgeny Roizman, historian and mayor of Russia's third-largest city, Yekaterinburg, summed it up best when he said, "The Soviet Union broke up without a civil war, thank God." While these dramatic events may have been a major factor that spurred Naisbitt to make the political connection with his economic trends forecast in Global Paradox, it is unlikely they were the only thing. Self-determination was the single dominant factor in international relations in the 20th century. Both world wars were driven by imperialist claims to dominion over a variety of people, and were fueled by dreams of territorial conquest. However, they were defined by the resistance to those aims and support for the right of people to determine how and by whom they would be governed. The battlefields of Europe, Asia, and Africa are soaked with the blood of tens of millions of soldiers who fought and died to defend the right of self-determination. Sometimes it was their own self-determination. More often than not, it was for the right of self-determination for someone else. The devastation wrought was such that the countries of the world, before, during, and after, struggled to come to grips with every aspect of self-determination and to create a framework under which people that wanted to govern themselves had the opportunity to do so without bloodshed. While self-determination came into its own in the 20th century, its roots go back into antiquity. Since the dawn of civilization, tribes and nations have resisted outside governance. Throughout history, wherever you find an empire, you find resistance to its domination. However, the modern expression for a conscious self-determination can be traced back directly to the American Revolution. The writings and actions of those who were considered the Founding Fathers, inspired by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, laid the groundwork for modern political thought on the matter. The case for self-determination is discussed in the writings of the day and succinctly described in the official documents of the era. You find the core principle of self-determination enshrined in the Declaration of Independence of the 13 colonies and the latter Texas Declaration of Independence, which is this: governments govern only by consent of the governed. As the new imperialism swept across the world in the 19th century, people around the world, either consciously or unconsciously, embraced the core principle of the American Revolution. Much as it was in antiquity, so it was into the early 20th century. Empires grasped their possessions ever tighter. Yet the tighter their grip, the more the desire for self-determination flourished. Well, sounds kind of like, Leia talking to Governor Tarkin. The more you tighten your grip, the more star systems slip through your fingers. Kind of feels like that right now in the United States. If you kind of look at, the things where states try to stand up for themselves, and then the federal government comes in and acts like it has supremacy, and you have to bow down to what we say, and this, that, and the other. But in the end, if states stand up to it, the federal government is a paper tiger. It has no way to enforce over the states, the things that it wants. So the more Mordor tightens its grip, the more states will slip out of its fingers. So continuing, monarchies fell, empires weakened, and nations began to reassert their independence. Governments around the world had to come to grips with the changing political landscape and the new geopolitical realities. After the United States' brief flirtation with overseas empire building in the late 1800s, President Woodrow Wilson kicked off the global discussion on self-determination when he issued his famous 14 points. How ironic. That's me. In an attempt to end the First World War and prevent future global conflicts, Wilson laid out a plan that he believed would ensure peace. The majority of the 14 items were specific to the war and were meant to be terms of a peace treaty at the end of the war. Embedded in each of these items were subtle calls for respecting the right of self-determination for the people in the areas affected by the war. His final point, however, was not so subtle. Quote, "A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Unquote. To clarify and reinforce his call for self-determination, Wilson gave a speech to a joint session of Congress in February of 1918. In the speech, he was very clear as to what he felt was the key underlying reason for the war. This war had its roots in the disregard of the rights of small nations and of nationalities which lacked the union and the force to make good their claim to determine their own allegiances and their own forms of political life. Wilson, perhaps channeling Thomas Jefferson, issued a caution for those governments that failed to respect the right of self-determination. Quote, "National aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase, it is an imperative principle of action which statesmen will henceforth ignore at their own peril." Unquote. After 18 million died in World War I, the winning side still chose to ignore Wilson's warning. The Treaty of Versailles that ended the war relied more on a thirst for retribution than an acknowledgement of the true causes of the war, and relegated the issues of self-determination raised by Wilson to the back burner. In 1945, the peril warned of by Wilson would be counted in 60 to 80 million lives lost in the Second World War. Reeling from the loss of a full 3% of the world's population, the global community began to seriously and consciously contemplate self-determination. As the post-war Iron Curtain of communism descended over Europe, it seemed that the lessons learned from 2 world wars would be ignored yet again. They weren't, but it took some time for them to be implemented. The first major international attempt to enshrine self-determination as an acknowledged and fundamental right of nations and people came in the Charter of the United Nations. For all of its failings and weaknesses, there was at least an attempt to place self-determination in the forefront of geopolitical thought, if not entirely in practice. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Unquote. These words are found in Article 1, Section 2 of the United Nations Charter and serve as one of the stated purposes of the organization. It is these words that have guided the international community in support of self-determination around the world ever since. At the founding of the United Nations in 1945, 750 million people, nearly 1/3 of the world's population, lived under the authority of another power and did not enjoy the right of self-government. The conscious implementation of the principle of self-determination was the driving force behind a decades-long international effort of decolonization. Today, that number is approximately 2 million. The success of decolonization inspired other nations who were fully incorporated into other countries or were members of a larger political and economic union to reevaluate their individual situations and choose independence. The effect was nothing less than miraculous. People who were told their entire lives that they were incapable of self-government found themselves masters of their own destiny. No matter the size, no matter the perceived difficulties, they became nations that stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had once held them in check. Global exit in the 21st century. Naisbitt identified the trend in 1994. The right of self-determination was gaining clarity in converts who were willing to embrace it. However, larger Western powers who thought they were immune to its effects, close to their centers of power, entered the 21st century in a state of denial about the power, scope, and inspirational potential of self-determination. The two collections of peoples who were, and still are, in the deepest denial were both born of self-determination in response to imperial overreach. They purport to be the biggest champions of the right of peoples around the world to self-government, and each has used military force in support of independence in every corner of the world, shedding precious blood in its defense. These two are none other than Europe and the United States. If there was any thought that Europe and the United States would somehow buck the global trend towards self-determination, the Brexit vote in June 2016 put an end to that speculation. In the minds of TEXIT advocates and advocates of other independence movements, the real story was that voters in a first world country had gone to the ballot box and chosen to separate from a bloated, bureaucratic, political, and economic union that was becoming more centralized and authoritarian in its drive toward a more perfect union. In short, if the United Kingdom can reclaim its sovereignty and right of self-government, anyone can. Brexit has sparked a renewed drive towards a second Scottish referendum and given hope to scores of other Eurosceptic movements on the continent that have been questioning their relationship within the European Union for years. Its effects have been felt in the United States as well. By adding one key element to the debate, hope, it has had a dramatic effect in Texas as well as New Hampshire, Vermont, and California. It is spurring conversations and political action, and encouraging people in the states to fundamentally re-examine their state's place within the Union. The movements of the 21st century are fueled less by old grievances over territory and more by pragmatic issues of economics and self-governance. The idea that the people of a nation-state must give up the right of self-government and an identity as part of a larger union or country to adequately address trade or national security concerns is becoming increasingly anachronistic in this century. This realization is responsible for fueling more independence movements than ever around the world. For every movement that grabs the attention of the United States, there are far more that do not. These movements, however, show the universality of the desire for self-determination and self-government. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, is home to several independence movements in various states of organization. There's a well-known and politically successful Parti Québécois in Quebec that has forced multiple referenda on independence. There is the Alberta Independence Movement that is at the forefront of a movement to lead all of the western provinces from under the thumb of Ottawa. There are also scattered movements within the Atlantic provinces in eastern Canada. Canada's proximity to the United States and the discussions of independence in both has led to some interesting propositions. The late Dr. Thomas Naylor of the Second Vermont Republic proposed a confederation of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and the Atlantic provinces of Canada that would be the North American equivalent of Denmark. Similarly, there have been discussions about Oregon and Washington exiting the Union and joining with British Columbia in a Pacific Northwest confederation of these politically and socially aligned territories. Even to our south, we find self-determination rearing its head among those who were once considered the compatriots of Texans. There have been rumblings over the past decade of legitimate political movements organizing to have the northern states of Mexico leave and declare independence, resurrecting the idea of a Republic of the Rio Grande. Their grievances sound like those espoused by Texas advocates. They are tired of their developing industries serving as a cash cow for the less productive parts of Mexico. They are tired of illegal immigrants from Central America using their states as the jumping-off point for entry into Texas and the United States. Well, what does that sound like? Sounds very familiar today. So That's an interesting idea. Texas aligning with the southern states of Mexico to prevent this from even getting through those states of Mexico. I'll think on that one. Got a noodle there. They are tired of the lawlessness and violence of the cartels and the impotence or unwillingness of the Mexican federales to put a stop to it. Now, as far as that goes, there is a quick and simple solution to ending cartel violence. A lot of you faithful listener may not like to hear it, but it's the same thing that solved the mafia violence that occurred during Prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Yes, it's legalizing these drugs. You can say you want to regulate and tax and all that, all well and good. I'm not necessarily all for that, but if that's what it takes, okay. But the very fact that they are illegal and a black market is created for them, thus driving up the profit of them through the roof, making the risk worth it, that's what's funneling all this money to the cartels. That's what keeps them alive. They would be always against legalization because their business would go away overnight. Think about that idea for a second. Anyway, I continue. The central government in Mexico City is nervous enough about the possibility of a Republic of the Rio Grande that there have been proposals in recent years to change the official name of the country simply to Mexico from Estados Unidos Mexicanos, which translates into the United Mexican States, for fear that the name alone might bolster support for greater state sovereignty and outright independence. Even further south, we see a flourishing independence movement in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The Movimiento Sao Paulo Independente, MSPI, has been successful in taking their case to the people of Sao Paulo with messaging that should seem quite familiar. They believe the Brazilian central bureaucracy is too large and too inefficient. They advocate for lower taxes, decentralization of power, restoration of family values, and protection of the distinctiveness of their culture. Across the Atlantic in Africa, we are seeing self-determination raise its head under one of the most repressive regimes on the continent. The Matabeleland Liberation Organization is waging a peaceful fight to liberate its homeland from the clutches of the brutal dictatorship of Robert Mugabe and his successors. I guess it was Zimbabwe. Their leader, Paul Sewela, is under constant threat of arrest, and Mugabe loyalists have not been shy in their application of violence. However, Sewela and his allies persist in the face of threats of violence and accusations of treason. One of the biggest factors in the growth of independence movements in the 21st century has been the spread of globalism. Globalism seeks total economic integration across the planet. It is at its core Soviet-style central economic planning on an unprecedented scale. The effects of globalism have created poverty, unrest, and destruction around the world as the global elite seek to remake the world in their own image. Globalists, often public proponents of self-determination, harbor a deep-seated contempt for it. In their minds, self-determination, secession, and nationalism walk hand in hand, and all three are the true threat to the global elite's brand of globalism. Their brand of globalism views nation-states and all they entail as impediments to their dreams of a truly integrated world. In their world, borders, identities, and self-interest take a back seat to their true driving force money. In the words of Samuel P. Huntington, these transnationalists have little need for national loyalty, view national boundaries as obstacles that thankfully are vanishing, and see national governments as residues from the past whose only useful function is to facilitate the elite's global operations. To highlight the amount of fear that self-determination engenders in globalists, one only need to look at the remarks given by newly minted U.S. President Barack Obama at his Nobel Peace Prize lecture in 2009. Yeah, him winning that, if that doesn't completely negate any respect for that prize, I don't know what does. Quote, Obama, quote, "Moreover, wars between nations have increasingly given way to wars within nations. The resurgence of ethnic or sectarian conflicts, the growth of secessionist movements, insurgencies, and failed states, all these things have increasingly trapped civilians in unending chaos." Unquote. With the inclusion of secession alongside violent revolutions in failed states such as Somalia, Obama echoed the globalist talking points on self-determination. It's dangerous, chaotic, and should be avoided at all costs. However, given the recent successes of TEXIT, Texans are of a different opinion. TEXIT and mainstream politics. On the heels of the successful Brexit vote in June of 2016, Donald Trump, then the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States, visited Aberdeen, Scotland. During a press conference, a reporter asked Trump how he would react if Texans decided they wanted to Texit. "Texas will never do that, because Texas loves me," said Trump. While Trump, known for his off-the-cuff remarks, may not entirely believe that Texas's continued membership in the Union is entirely predicated on its love for him, the fact that the man who would go on to become President of the United States was asked the question and commented on it was big news. The larger story, however, was that a successful Brexit vote led to people in Texas calling for their own vote on Texit. News outlets throughout the United States echoed the party line. To them, a movement for Texit never existed until Brexit happened. At best, this was gross incompetence in reporting. At worst, it was malevolent by design. For each of the media outlets, it likely fell somewhere in between, because they all got their talking points from the same central factory, if you will. Continuing. The fact is that while Texas independence has been in the collective consciousness of Texans for decades, there have been some very recent examples of how the movement to make Texit a reality has entered into mainstream politics. All these happened prior to Brexit and prior to Trump's comment. In 2009, then Governor Rick Perry stood in front of thousands of protesters at an anti-tax rally in Austin. As he was making a point about overreach by the federal government, someone in the crowd yelled, "Secede!" to an eruption of cheers and applause. When asked about the response by the media after the rally, Perry reiterated that he didn't support Texas leaving the Union, but reinforced his belief that it was a possibility if the federal government continued on its current path. I think there's a lot of different scenarios. Texas is a unique place. When we came into the Union in 1845, one of the issues was that we would be able to leave if we decided to do that. My hope is that America, and Washington in particular, pays attention. We've got a great union. There's absolutely no reason to dissolve it. But if Washington continues to thumb their nose at the American people, who knows what may come of that. This is a very unique place, and we're a pretty independent lot to boot. This set off a firestorm in the media and among Perry's political opponents. Texas State Representative Jim Dunham expressed his disdain for Perry's comments at a press conference. Quote, "Talk of secession is an attack on our country. It can be nothing else. It is the ultimate anti-American statement." Unquote. What a mental midget this Jim Dunham is. He also didn't hold back when he speculated on Perry's motivations. Quote, "We all know he wanted to be president. I just didn't know it was president of the Republic of Texas." Unquote. Well, what's wrong with that? That's better. Perry, a Republican, went on to win re-election to become the longest-serving governor in the history of Texas, and now is a Secretary of Energy in the Trump administration, or was, as of this reading. Dunham, a Democrat, lost his seat in the Texas House of Representatives the next year to his Republican challenger. Good riddance, Dunham. You dumbass. Continuing. While expressing the possibility of Texit didn't hurt Perry politically, and there is no evidence to show that it directly helped him, there is some reason to believe that it energized his base, giving an indirect boost to his supporters at a time when he needed it. Much like Perry, there is no direct evidence that Dunham was hurt by his opposition to Perry's comments or his hyperbolic attack on supporters of Texit. However, Dunham lost his re-election bid by 1,648 votes. It's easy to imagine that, with Texit consistently polling solidly among independent and Republican voters, his remarks may have had enough of an impact to cost him the race. This wouldn't be the last time public officials would be forced to comment on the issue. In 2011, the Obama administration launched an initiative called We the People, an online system on whitehouse.gov that allowed citizens to create petitions. A petition receiving 25,000 signatures would elicit an official response from the White House. In 2012, a petition was created calling for Texas to leave the Union. In short order, petitions were started for all 50 states and were getting signatures. The Texas petition soon received 126,000 signatures, and 5 other states quickly reached the 25,000 vote threshold. I think I signed that. I'm trying to remember if I did, but it is ringing a bell. Anyway, recognizing that the administration of a sitting U.S. president would be, under rules that he established, forced to issue a public statement on states leaving the Union, a media frenzy ensued. Governors of states where the petition was gaining traction were asked about the issue, including Rick Perry. Perry echoed his comments from 2009, while other governors were caught flat-footed. Even presidential candidate Ron Paul was asked to chime in on the issue. Quote, "It's very American to talk about secession. That's how we came into being," Representative Paul commented. Absolutely. Ron Paul, a great man. One of the greatest, no question. By January of 2013, White House Office of Public Engagement Director John Carson issued the administration's official statement on the matter. In a 476-word response, Carson echoed the party line of the political establishment when he invoked the Supreme Court case of Texas v. White and declared that the Union was perpetual. The statement added nothing new to the conversation and offered no arguments as to why any state should stay in the Union. Instead, it reestablished the tired, weak battle lines of the argument that has been the sole refrain from the pro-federal side for over a century. As perpetual as the Union may seem to the Obama administration, it seems that Texans were of a different opinion. This fact wasn't missed by New York Times reporter Manny Fernandez in a story about the White House response. Quote, "On the opening day of the legislature here last Tuesday, supporters of the Texas Nationalist Movement, a group that wants Texas to sever its federal ties and become an independent nation, met with Republican leaders, including Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst. It was another sign that ideas once regarded as radical and even unpatriotic have found a measure of support, or at least sympathy, among some conservatives." Unquote. That support, still denied by the establishment, would become abundantly clear in 2015 as TEXIT grabbed international headlines from a source that few suspected, the State Republican Executive Committee. Following a statewide campaign by the TNM to force a non-binding vote on independence on the Republican primary ballot, Tanya Robertson, SREC committeewoman, submitted a resolution that would have done just that. Although outwardly soft-spoken, Robertson had already gained a reputation as being uncompromising on liberty issues and is a fearless advocate for greater transparency within the Republican Party of Texas, and a greater voice for the party in the creation and execution of public policy. Her uncompromising, principle-based approach has earned her the nickname T-Rex by her colleagues and foes alike. Rather than being a shot in the dark on TEXIT, Robertson's resolution was more reflective of the sentiments of Texas Republicans than its critics would admit. Polling data had consistently shown that Republican voters in Texas support independence in large numbers. While the resolution didn't explicitly call for independence, it did express the sentiment that Texans, at the very least, should be able to publicly debate and vote on the issue. And why not? If it's not that big a deal, then what do they have to fear? You know, isn't that what they always say to us? You know, if you don't have anything to hide, then what do you care whether we look into your business? You know, or they say, and we always say, well, you know, make speech free. Let everyone see the speech. Put light on it so that everyone can see it and judge for themselves. You know, stupid ideas will eliminate themselves pretty quickly. So I don't know. Let's see. Anyway, continuing. Binding or not, Robertson's resolution ignited a media frenzy. In an interview with the Houston Chronicle, or Houston Comical, as it should be called, she was clear about her reason for submitting the proposal. There's been a big groundswell of Texans that are getting into the Texas independence issue. I believe conservatives in Texas should have a choice to voice their opinion. Republican Chairman Tom Meckler was indignant, stating that he didn't believe that it would gain any traction. Much like he would do in 2016 at the Republican State Convention, Meckler pursued a strategy of deny publicly, defy privately. However, on the first day of the SREC meeting, in full defiance of Meckler's prediction, the measure passed the Resolutions Committee, moving it to a full floor vote of the SREC and putting it one step closer to being on the ballot the following March. The Resolutions Committee meeting wasn't free of drama, though. In an unprecedented act, the committee allowed public testimony only on this resolution. In addition, there were many proposed ballot resolutions on the table, including the hot-button issues of abortion, transgender bathroom policy, school choice, and gun-free zones, including a borderline exercise in narcissism by Governor Greg Abbott in the form of a resolution asking if voters supported his agenda. Due to the volume of proposals, the committee agreed to allow only 5 that received the highest number of votes by the committee. Robertson's resolution was one of the 5. Abbott's didn't make the cut. Meckler was in a panic. As evidenced by his not-so-private dressing down of the committee chairman, Mark Ramsey, in the hallway, the next day would belong to Meckler, or so he thought. After a long night of backroom politicking, Meckler flipped enough votes to ensure the defeat of the measure by the full body of the SREC. But as many often do, Meckler missed the point. The story, picked up and amplified by the media, was not solely that the measure was defeated. It was that more than 1/3 of the executive committee of the state's dominant political party voted in favor of Texans having a vote on independence. This vote continues to resonate in Texas politics to this very day. During the subsequent campaign cycle, it became increasingly common for incumbents and challengers for seats in the Texas legislature to be asked about TEXIT by the media. One notable example came in the contest between State Representative John Frullo and former State Representative Jim Lantroop. Both were asked by KCBD News in Lubbock about whether they would support legislation for a referendum on Texas independence. Lantroop was emphatic in his support. Quote, "I will fall on the sword for Texas' right to govern themselves. I'm open to any measure or means necessary in order to do that." Unquote. Good for him. Lantroop, you went up in esteem in my book. We'll have to follow up on that guy. Continuing, perhaps with the consequences of Dunham's full-throated denunciation of Rick Perry's remarks on the subject in his mind, Frullo chose to leave the door open. Quote, "Secession is one of those things that we all like to talk about. We dream about, we feel that we can do better individually as Texans and as well as a state if we didn't have Washington, D.C. out there helping us. So that's the exciting part. If you look into reality, it becomes a lot more complex." Oh, God, what a mealy mouth. Everything in the world is complex, but doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I mean, that goes without saying, you Dingeldorf. All right, anyway, continuing. Even after the election, sitting elected officials were asked to sound off on the matter. After the post-Brexit TEXIT surge, Governor Abbott spoke with Fox News' host Sean Hannity on Hannity's radio show about the prospects of Texas independence, where Hannity asked, "Do you think it ever gets to the point that the good people of Texas and their values of freedom separate themselves from the United States and go on their own?" Unquote. Abbott's answer came as a surprise. Rather than denouncing TEXIT or talking about the greatness of the Union like his predecessor, Abbott acknowledged the trend towards self-determination and self-government and the pain caused when it is ignored or denied. Quote, "You brought up Brexit. This is something that's going on not just in the United States, but this is something that's going on across the entire globe, and there's a reason for it. Sovereignty is a key component of a nation, and we've seen the United States, we've seen Great Britain, we've seen countries in Europe sacrifice their sovereignty, and we've seen the way their citizens have suffered because of it." Unquote. Still mealy mouth. Typical Abbott. And typical Abbott blowing with the wind. You know, he'll go along with it and become the greatest proponent if this thing really takes off. When this thing really takes off. Of course, he won't be governor by then, probably, so who knows where he'll be. Continuing, the flow of independence-related questions being put to elected officials didn't slow down after Brexit left the domestic news cycles. State representatives and senators have been fielding these questions ever since, not from the media, but from voters. At a meeting of the Southeast Texas Tea Party in late 2016, State Representative Dade Phelan was forced to take a public position on the issue. When asked by a constituent if he supported Texas independence, he point-blank expressed his opposition. However, in a follow-up question, he was asked, "If you represent us and enough of us want it, will you stand in the way?" Phelan, to his credit, stated that as a representative of the district, if enough of his constituents wanted to vote on the issue, he would support legislation that would give him that opportunity. Okay, didn't quite directly answer the question. but at least it's not like no way, I guess. Tanya Robertson's resolution and subsequent convention fight came full circle to the Republican Party of Texas. In the spring of 2016, Meckler resigned as party chair. Although he didn't officially endorse a successor, Meckler made phone calls to the SREC members advocating for Rick Figueroa. Figueroa is seen as a rising star among Republicans in Texas. He was a vocal advocate for Hispanic engagement in the Trump campaign machine, a demographic into which the state's Republicans are eager to tap. On the other side stood James Dickey, the chairman of the Republican Party of Travis County, in which the state's capital is located, and a longtime political activist in Republican circles. While Dickey was supported by grassroots conservatives, Figueroa was lining up support from the political establishment. During their final debate, held the night before the SREC vote, both candidates were asked about their position on the issue of Texas independence that had come up in Robertson's resolution and during the state convention. Figueroa gave an emphatic denunciation. Dickey answered that, as the chair, it wouldn't be his place to make that decision, and that he would leave it up to the will of the body. The next day, James Dickey was elected as the new chair of the Republican Party of Texas. TEXIT had arrived. And that's the end of the first chapter. Good stuff. Very interesting. A lot of that political stuff I did not know about. So I have to follow up a little bit more on that, for sure. I want to know... I want to know what my state senator, was it Donna Campbell and Representative Carrie Isaac, what they believe about it. And then I'd be interested to know what my U.S. Representative Chip Roy thinks about it. I'm sure it seems like he would be for it, but I'm not sure. But definitely, I want to know about Isaac and Campbell. Get their opinion on the situation. I'll try to do that. See how I can go about finding out the answer to that question. That'll be interesting. So stay tuned. See what comes back on that. What I find on that. But yeah, it occurs to me, and I need this Texas nationalist movement. I mentioned in the last podcast that I'm on Twitter now, commenting on things and whatnot, and I see that Twitter account posting a lot, and I need to look in to see are they possibly getting involved in that thing and see how truly organized it is. I'd recommend you do it as well. I don't know too much about it quite yet, just what I've read in this book and what I've seen on the Twitter. So I can't necessarily endorse it. I don't know if it's an actual official organization to become a member of, or if it's more just like a nameplate for the TEXIT movement in general. But it sounds like it's a kind of an organized thing. So I don't know. Let me look more into that, and I'll get back up with you on what's going on there. It's pretty interesting. So, reading that stuff about the inner workings of at least the Republican Party gives me some hope. It's the smoldering embers, of a possible brush fire that could be started, and that's all it takes. All it takes, per Samuel Adams, he said, "It does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men." That's all you got to do. We got to set. This podcast exists to set a brush fire in your mind and in the mind of your friends, whom I hope you talk to about this idea. Your other Texan friends and everything. As I've said in the past, there really in the end is no other option. If we don't do it, we will go down with the U.S. imperial ship. And we don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want that for my children. I'm sure you don't want it for your children, grandchildren, what have you. So TEXIT really and truly is the only way to go. So with that, stick around for the next installment of not just the next chapter of this book, but the next installment of the podcast. I'm starting to get a hang of it, starting to gain a little momentum. This is fun. This is helping me organize my thoughts a little better, kind of see what the pay attention more in depth about what the opposition to the idea is, what the how tall the mountain is that we got to climb. You know, I'm curious how many base camps there'll be. I don't know. But we shall find out. So with that, I bid you adieu and a good day, evening, whatever it may be, and I will catch you on the next one.
Well, I hope the bandits gave you an interesting episode that either entertained or educated you. Or better yet, both. Hell, I told them this podcasting thing looks harder to do than defeating Santa Anna. So if you would, please help them out by sharing it with all your like-minded friends to help the bandits get the word out. And don't forget to check us out at feedbandit.com and grab some gear and apparel to support the cause of Texas. Remember, Texas, above all else, preserve the tradition, protect the legacy. Finally, as I said some time ago on the eve of the great battle, and I vigorously repeat here again, be men, be free men, that your children may bless their father's name. Well, fellow bandit, until next time.